Officer Rachel Monroe had seen many strange things in her 10 years on the force, but nothing quite like the pair of golden eyes staring at her from the tree line as she ended her patrol that late autumn evening. The sun dipped below the edge of the forest, casting long shadows across the rural stretch of highway she'd been assigned to for the past 2 weeks. With her cruiser parked just off the shoulder, Rachel leaned against the hood, sipping from her thermos, enjoying the brief moment of stillness. That's when she saw it, movement, just at the edge of the trees. Her hand instinctively moved toward her holster, eyes narrowing. But instead of a human figure, out stepped a small creature, fur mottled with dusty brown and grey, tufts of black-tipped ears alert, a tiny nose twitching. A bobcat kitten, maybe a few months old at most, barely bigger than a house cat. It was alone. And it was looking directly at her. Rachel straightened up, her heart tugging before her mind could intervene. She knew better than to approach wildlife, especially something like a bobcat. Even a young one could be unpredictable. Still, there was something different about this little thing. It didn't run. It didn't snarl or hiss. It took a tentative step forward, then another, its wide eyes locked on her face. For a moment, Rachel stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She took a step back toward her cruiser, and the kitten followed. When she opened the door, it sat down beside the front tire, looking up at her with a gaze so intense it was almost human. She chuckled nervously. "You lost, little guy," she murmured, crouching a safe distance away. "Where's your mama?" No answer, of course, but the question haunted her as she drove off. She checked her mirrors repeatedly. To her astonishment, the tiny bobcat followed her. At first, it stayed on the shoulder, trotting behind the cruiser like a shadow. Then it ducked into the woods, running parallel to the road. She lost sight of it, but when she stopped at a rural intersection 15 minutes later, there it was again, sitting by the signpost, waiting. Rachel blinked. "No way," she muttered, rolling down the window. "You're fast, I'll give you that." That night, back at the station, Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the kitten. She brushed it off when other officers asked what was on her mind, blaming exhaustion, but her thoughts kept returning to those bright eyes in the twilight. The next day, as her shift took her back out to the same stretch of road, she slowed at the same spot. Nothing. Just the whisper of wind through bare branches. She sighed, disappointed in a way that surprised her. But as she reached for her thermos again, there it was, crouched by a fallen log, its tail flicking. The moment their eyes met, it stood and trotted toward her like it had been waiting all night. Rachel got out slowly, crouching near the car. "You again, hey," she said softly. The kitten mewed. A soft, rasping sound, and inched closer. It didn't seem scared. On the contrary, it looked hopeful. She could see its ribs now. It was clearly starving. And despite everything she'd been taught about leaving wild animals alone, she reached into her bag and pulled out a protein bar, tearing off a corner and setting it gently on the ground a few feet away. The bobcat sniffed it, then pounced. It devoured the morsel in seconds, then looked back up at her with expectant eyes. "That's all I've got," she said with a sad smile. "You need to be out in the wild, not tailing a cop car." But the kitten didn't leave. It followed her again. That day, and the next. By the fourth day, Rachel had started leaving a small dish of food in her trunk. She told herself it was just until she could contact animal control, maybe get the little thing to a wildlife rehab center. But deep down, she didn't want to. Every time she saw those eyes, so round, so full of unspoken emotion. It was like looking into a soul in pain. And Rachel knew something about pain. Ever since her sister had died in a hit-and-run 3 years ago, she'd felt a hole inside her that she'd tried to fill with work, with duty, with silence. This little creature didn't speak, but it didn't need to. It followed her, trusted her, without question. It never ran. It never scratched or bit. It simply showed up, day after day, looking like it had nowhere else to go. By the end of the week, she gave it a name, Ash. It came from the soot-colored smudges along its fur and the way it always seemed to appear from the grey shadows. Ash had begun to sit near her cruiser as she wrote reports, curled up just a few feet away, tail tucked. It never strayed far. Rachel would leave food, sometimes even talk to it in a low, gentle voice. Other officers began to tease her when they found out. "You adopting a forest pet now, Monroe?" they joked. She laughed it off, but inside, she felt a growing sense of protectiveness. This wasn't a pet. This was something else. A presence. A silent companion. One morning, about 2 weeks after their first meeting, Rachel found Ash waiting on her front porch. The shock nearly made her drop her coffee. She lived a good 20 miles from the forest route. How the tiny bobcat had found her, she couldn't begin to imagine. "What the hell, Ash?" she whispered, stunned. Ash sat down, blinking slowly, as if to say, "I'm here now." Rachel opened the door halfway. "You can't just follow me home," she murmured. But she didn't close the door. And when Ash padded in a step, then another, she didn't stop him. The following days were filled with confusion. Rachel researched everything she could about bobcat behavior. Nothing added up. These animals weren't supposed to bond with humans, especially not adults like Ash. They didn't follow people for miles or stare into their eyes with heartbreaking understanding. She even called a local wildlife biologist, who told her gently but firmly that if the kitten was orphaned, it might be imprinting on her. "But don't get attached," the biologist warned. "Eventually, you'll have to release it. Or hand it over." Rachel thanked her but didn't mention Ash sleeping curled up near her bed that very night, or the way he rubbed his head against her hand when she got home. She knew she couldn't keep him forever. But she also couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something more going on. One night, as wind howled outside and rain lashed against the windows, Rachel sat cross-legged on her living room floor, Ash curled up in her lap, trembling. Thunder cracked and he pressed against her tighter, eyes wide with some old memory that sent shivers down her spine. She stroked his fur and whispered, "What happened to you, Ash? Where did you come from?" She didn't expect an answer. But 2 days later, while patrolling near the trailhead where she'd first seen him, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a shallow depression beneath an outcropping of stone, half covered with fallen leaves. Inside were the remnants of a torn-up blanket, bits of fur, and something that made Rachel's breath catch in her throat, a rusted metal collar with a small, heart-shaped tag. Her gloved hand reached down, brushing off the dirt. The tag read, faintly, "Sasha, if found, please call." But the number had been scratched out. Deliberately. And there were claw marks, old ones, on the stone walls surrounding the small shelter. Rachel's hand shook. This hadn't been just a wild kitten's den. This had been a hideout. A refuge. Possibly a prison. And maybe Ash had escaped something terrible. Maybe the reason he followed her wasn't just hunger or loneliness, but hope. Hope that someone would finally see the truth. That someone would care. As Rachel stood there, Ash suddenly emerged from the brush behind her, mewing lowly, his body rigid. He walked past her and stood beside the little makeshift den, looking in, then back up at her. Not scared. Not confused. Just waiting. Like he wanted her to see. And Rachel did. The tiny bobcat wasn't following her by accident. He had a story. One that wasn't over yet. And somehow, for reasons she didn't understand yet, she was a part of it. Rachel didn't sleep much the night she found the rusted collar. The image of the scratched-out name tag and the tattered blanket haunted her every time she closed her eyes. Her gut told her something terrible had happened in that small hollow beneath the rocks, something more than just a baby bobcat losing its mother. She kept replaying the moment when Ash had stood beside the den, not afraid, but determined, like he'd led her there on purpose. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just instinct or accident. It felt personal. Like Ash had chosen her to help him uncover something buried, something wrong. That thought alone both frightened and compelled her. The next morning, Rachel went back to the site with gloves, a flashlight, and a small evidence bag tucked into her patrol vest. Officially, she was off duty, but she'd told Dispatch she'd be checking in on a potential poaching site. That was close enough to the truth. As she crouched by the hollow, she examined the old bedding more closely. The blanket was thick, synthetic, the kind used for camping or maybe by the homeless. It had been shredded, both by claws and, she realized grimly, possibly by something sharper. There were small, rust-colored stains on the fabric, faded but unmistakably blood. Rachel's stomach clenched. She dug a little deeper. Beneath the leaves and dirt, she found 2 more items, a broken zipper pull and a fragment of what looked like a child's shoe sole, barely bigger than her palm. Her heart began to race. A bobcat wouldn't be using a child's shoe for nesting material. No animal would. This wasn't just an abandoned den. Someone had been here. A person. Maybe more than one. And not too long ago. Her thoughts flashed to Ash, who now sat a few feet away on a mossy rock, watching her quietly. He didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Just waited. Rachel took a breath and carefully bagged the items. This wasn't something she could ignore. She'd need to report it, but not yet. Not until she had more. She knew the system too well. If she brought this to her superior without hard proof, it would be written off as the remnant of a transient camp or wildlife scavenging. But something in her bones told her otherwise. This was connected to Ash. Somehow, it was all connected. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat in her kitchen with the collar laid gently on a dish towel. The name, Sasha, had nearly been scratched out completely, but her years on the force had taught her tricks for reading faded etchings. Under a magnifying glass and angled light, she could just make out the beginning of a phone number. The area code was local. She jotted it down on a notepad, her mind already racing with possibilities. Could Sasha have been a pet? Or be someone's child? Was it even a name tag from a bobcat collar? Or had someone put it on the animal to hide what it really was? She did some quiet digging that night, using public databases, social media, and old police logs. After hours of scanning through outdated posts, she found something that made her hand freeze on the mouse. An archived missing persons report from over a year ago. A woman named Marlene Harper had vanished while camping with her 6-year-old daughter, Sasha. They had gone off-grid for a weekend in the state forest to escape domestic violence. Only the mother's body was found 2 weeks later, deep in the woods, mauled by what authorities ruled as a wild animal. But Sasha was never located. The case had gone cold. The photo in the article made Rachel's breath catch, Sasha, smiling with 2 missing front teeth, holding a stuffed bobcat toy. In the corner of the picture, barely visible, was a real bobcat kitten sitting in a playpen behind her. Rachel stared. It wasn't possible, was it? She glanced at Ash, curled up in the laundry room on a pile of towels. He was larger now than the photo's kitten, but the ear pattern, the markings on the side of the face, they were too similar. Her mind reeled. Could Ash have been that same bobcat? Raised beside Sasha? Could he have survived whatever happened that night? A part of her resisted the idea. It was too unbelievable. But another part of her, the same instinct that had made her trust Ash when he first approached, told her this was the truth. And if Ash had stayed near that campsite all this time, waiting, guarding, following people who might help, then maybe Sasha was still alive. The next morning, Rachel returned to the station. She filed a quiet request to access the Harper case file, citing an unrelated investigation for the forest area. As a senior officer with rural jurisdiction, her request wasn't questioned. She received a scanned folder with the original field notes, witness interviews, and forensics. The report had inconsistencies that stood out like red flags. The autopsy ruled the mother's death as consistent with animal attack, but there were vague mentions of possible ligature marks on her wrists. No clear signs of a campfire, no food remains, and no tent equipment found. It was like they had vanished into the trees, then been found mauled. Or, in Marlene's case, left to be mauled. Rachel took all of this in with a growing sense of dread. Ash had found her for a reason. He had led her to the evidence. Now she needed to trust him again. The next logical step was the deeper parts of the forest, beyond where the search teams had gone. Maybe Sasha had survived. Maybe she had grown feral, hiding from the world. Or worse, maybe someone had taken her. It was late afternoon when Rachel returned to the forest, Ash trotting at her heels with surprising confidence. She'd packed light, water, protein bars, flashlight, compass, and her service pistol. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but Ash was already ahead of her, weaving through underbrush with purpose. It was clear he knew where he was going. He stopped often, checking back to see if she was still behind him, and when she slowed, he waited. The hike took them deeper into the wild than she'd ever gone, past steep inclines and mossy cliffs. After an hour of silent movement, Ash stopped at a clearing. It was surrounded by boulders, half concealed by fallen branches and thornbush. In the center was what looked like an old hunting cabin, overgrown with ivy and barely standing. Rachel's heart pounded. The place looked abandoned, but not forgotten. Ash crouched low, ears back, his body stiff. Rachel pulled out her flashlight and stepped forward, her boots crunching on the gravel. The front door was ajar, hanging by a hinge. She nudged it open with her foot and swept the beam across the dark interior. The smell hit her first, musty, damp, tinged with old rot. Inside, the space was cluttered with broken furniture, empty cans, and tattered blankets. But what caught her eye was the makeshift bed in the corner, a pile of fresh leaves and cloth, and beside it, a crude carving on the wall. For letters scratched into the wood, SASH. The final 8 seemed half-formed, like it had been interrupted. Rachel froze. Ash, she whispered. He let out a soft sound behind her, almost a whimper. Then, suddenly, a noise, a rustling from the back of the cabin. Rachel's hand went to her weapon. "Who's there?" as she called. No answer. She stepped closer, toward a curtained back room. The curtain moved. And then she saw her. A pair of wide, frightened eyes stared at Rachel from the darkened room. Tangled hair, smeared with mud, peeked from behind a fallen beam. The child, barely more than skin and bones, crouched protectively beside a bundle of leaves and sticks. Rachel's breath caught. The girl didn't run. She just stared, frozen, unsure whether the officer in front of her was friend or threat. "Sasha?" Rachel said gently, lowering herself to her knees. "Is your name Sasha?" The girl blinked. Slowly. Cautiously. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in weeks, she whispered, "Ash." Behind Rachel, the Bobcat stepped forward, his ears perked. He walked slowly to the edge of the room, mewing softly. The girl's face changed. Her lips trembled. "Ash," she said again, louder this time, and the tears began to fall. Rachel felt her own eyes blur as she watched the impossible reunion unfold. The tiny Bobcat who had followed her for weeks hadn't been lost. He'd been leading her. Guiding her. Back to the little girl he'd protected for over a year, deep in the wilderness, against all odds. And as Rachel gently reached out to gather Sasha into her arms, the girl buried her face in the officer's chest and sobbed, the word "Mama" falling from her lips like a broken prayer. Rachel held her tight, and for the first time in years, she cried too. Because this wasn't just a rescue. It was redemption. For Sasha. For Ash. And maybe, just maybe, for herself. Rachel didn't move for a long time. She knelt on the dusty floor of the broken-down cabin, holding Sasha tightly against her chest as the little girl trembled with quiet sobs. Ash nestled beside them, his golden eyes flicking between the child and the woman who had finally pieced together the puzzle. The silence in that moment was sacred, fragile and thick with emotion. Rachel could feel the child's ribs beneath her shirt, the way Sasha flinched even at gentle sounds. This was a girl who had learned to survive in the shadows, who had gone without warmth, without comfort, without a voice. And yet she was still here, alive. Not because of luck, but because a tiny wild bobcat had refused to give up on her. When Rachel finally found the strength to move, she carried Sasha out into the light. The girl winced at the brightness but didn't let go. Rachel wrapped her in the emergency blanket from her backpack, letting the child rest her head against her shoulder. Ash followed closely, more like a bodyguard than a wild animal. Rachel glanced back at the cabin, the sight of so many unanswered questions, and then back down at the girl in her arms. "We're going home," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But the journey back wasn't simple. Sasha was dehydrated, malnourished, and frightened. She didn't speak again for the first hour of the hike. Rachel gave her sips of water and offered her protein bars, which Sasha nibbled on slowly, her tiny hands shaking with each bite. Ash never strayed more than a few feet, walking just ahead or beside them, pausing only when Sasha paused. At one point, the girl reached out and grabbed the tip of his tail, holding onto it like a guide rope. Ash didn't flinch. He just kept walking. When Rachel finally reached the edge of the forest and called in the emergency, the response was instant. Helicopters, EMTs, police vehicles, they descended on the area like a swarm. Rachel shielded Sasha from the chaos, speaking gently to her and refusing to hand her over until she could be sure Sasha wouldn't be overwhelmed. She made one thing clear to the officers on the scene: Sasha wasn't a case number. She was a survivor. And she needed safety, not interrogation. A few hours later, after Sasha had been admitted to the nearest hospital and placed under protective watch, Rachel sat beside her bed. Doctors had confirmed the child had survived for over a year in the wild, with only animal tracks and vague signs of human shelter suggesting how she'd made it. Sasha's body bore old scars, bruises that had healed badly, and a jagged mark across her wrist, like she had once been tied. Rachel's stomach churned at the implications. Eventually, a child psychologist was brought in to gently begin the process of drawing out Sasha's story. The sessions were short and careful. Rachel was allowed to stay in the room, and Ash, after some intense back and forth with hospital staff, was permitted to rest on a blanket in the corner as long as he remained calm. Surprisingly, he behaved better than many people. And Sasha wouldn't speak unless she could see him. Over the next few days, pieces of the truth began to surface. Sasha spoke in broken phrases at first, her voice barely audible. But as she grew to trust the warmth around her, the story emerged like a whisper in the dark. Her mother, Marlene, had fled with her into the forest to escape an abusive ex-partner. At first, it had just been the two of them and the young Bobcat kitten they'd raised together, Ash. But the man had found them. He came to the woods with anger and something far worse. What Sasha remembered next was chaos, shouting, pain, her mother crying out. Sasha said she hid in the rocks, just like her mother had told her, while Ash tried to defend them. She remembered being pulled from the den by the man and then being taken to the old hunting cabin. Rachel clenched her fists as she listened. According to Sasha, the man had used the cabin as a hideout. He'd kept her there for days, maybe weeks. It was hard to tell, Sasha said, because she never saw the sun. Sometimes he brought her food. Sometimes he didn't. One day, there had been a struggle, shouting, a gunshot. Sasha remembered Ash's eyes appearing through a hole in the wall and the bobcat clawing at the door. And then, somehow, the man was gone. Sasha never said how. She only said that Ash had come inside after the silence and laid next to her. He brought her food. He stayed with her. He never left. Rachel knew enough about trauma to recognize when a child was protecting herself from the worst parts of the memory. It was possible the man had been injured or killed and his body had never been found. Or perhaps he had fled, assuming Sasha wouldn't survive alone. Either way, Rachel knew this: Ash had saved her life more than once. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Media outlets ran stories about the wild girl of Pine Valley and the Bobcat hero who had protected her. Offers for interviews poured in, but Rachel shielded Sasha from all of it. She made a public statement emphasizing the child's right to privacy and insisted that Ash not be taken by animal control or wildlife authorities. She fought hard to keep him out of captivity, and won. With the help of a local sanctuary and a sympathetic judge, Ash was granted a special status as a therapy animal under the care of trained professionals, with Sasha given unlimited visitation. But even with the legal battles behind them, the healing had only begun. Rachel started visiting Sasha every day. The bond between them grew in quiet ways, shared drawings, whispered stories, bedtime songs hummed off-key. Sasha had lost her mother. Rachel had no children of her own. But in each other, they found something missing. Something real. Weeks later, while visiting the sanctuary, Rachel watched as Sasha sat cross-legged in the grass, Ash curled against her like a protective guardian. The sun filtered through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, Sasha smiled, really smiled. Rachel felt her throat tighten. She walked over and sat beside them, brushing Sasha's tangled hair behind her ear. "Do you ever wonder why he followed me?" Rachel asked softly. Sasha nodded. "Because he knew you were good." Rachel blinked. "What do you mean?" The girl looked at her with clear, steady eyes. Ash watched people. A lot. But he waited. He waited for the one who felt like her. Like Mama. Rachel's heart cracked wide open. She reached out, and Sasha took her hand. That night, Rachel sat on her porch with Ash lying beside her, staring out into the quiet sky. She thought about the kind of courage it took for a wild creature to seek help, to trust a human, to guide them not just through the forest but through the mystery of heartbreak and survival. Ash had seen something in her that she hadn't yet seen in herself, a woman who could protect, who could care, who wouldn't turn away when things got hard. In time, Sasha grew stronger. She began attending school, making friends, laughing again. Rachel filed the papers to become her foster guardian and eventually adopted her. It was a long process, filled with interviews and evaluations, but when the final court day came, Sasha ran into Rachel's arms and whispered, "We're a real pack now." And Ash? He remained a part of their family, sometimes living at the sanctuary, sometimes spending weekends in their backyard under the stars. He was no longer just a wild bobcat. He was the bridge between tragedy and healing, the creature who had carried a child's silent cry through the forest and placed it in the hands of someone who could answer it. As the years passed, people in the town still talked about the miracle in the woods, the tiny bobcat who wouldn't stop following a cop. But to Rachel and Sasha, it was never just a miracle. It was love. Fierce, silent, and unstoppable. And every time Rachel looked into Ash's golden eyes, she remembered, some instincts are stronger than fear. And some animals are more human than we ever give them credit for.